Start the webinar. Okay, webinar is now live. All right, so we will begin. I'm going to share my screen here. Just a second. All right. So there we go. Welcome to this meeting of Science Court. This is actually one of our class periods, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Kerri Miller to this class. So I think anybody who's from Minnesota or anywhere in the vicinity knows who Kerri Miller is. She's a host of MPR News with Kerri Miller, Talking Volumes, and The Thread. Just brief background is she was a political reporter for KARE 11 in Minneapolis, St. Paul before coming to MPR in 2004. On a personal level, I mean, if I don't know Kerri that well, but I've been listening to her show for many years. In fact, I came to Minnesota in 2005, so close to when she started in MPR. And I'm not usually prone to being a fan by personality, but I am unabashedly a fan of Kerri Miller. I think she has an amazing ability to take complicated topics and dissect them in a science-based fashion. You know, if you've listened to her morning shows, she brings in experts. She's able to talk to these experts and weave in questions from the audience in a really masterful way. And one of the things I've noticed is that she's able to strike what I think is a very difficult balance between, you know, keeping people honest and really sticking to what the science says on things, and still maintaining an environment which is welcoming to everybody. And so I think it's a real skill. And this is really the reason that we've asked her to come here, and that we're so pleased that she does, because we look forward to her not just to give us a talk about her background, but to really bring her technical skills to bear on the case that we're studying. Last year she came and we were doing nuclear power. The students were, it really made a huge impression on the students that visit, and really informed the way they prepare their case afterwards. And I'm sure today will be the same with our case now. So let me just briefly set this up in terms of where we are. Probably everybody here knows what Science Court is, because this really only went out to people who are involved in the project. So I don't really need to explain it in detail. I'll mention that this is a course that's part of the University of Minnesota Honors Program. We have strong support from the College of Science and Engineering and the Department of Aerospace Engineering and Mechanics, where I'm a faculty. Every semester we pick a case, we research the facts, we conduct a trial in front of a jury of representing the public, and we report on it. These are the people that are involved. In addition to myself, Lauren Klatch, who's a JD and social psychology student, CJ Sinner, who's a journalist at Star Trib, Gary Johnson, who serves as our legal advisor and is a retired estate law professional, Bill McGinnis, who's our judge, Jeremy Rose from the communications department, who works on jury facilitation, and then Corey Fleck, who is advising us and is sort of our expert on research methods. So the way Science Court works is that every semester we have a case which is written we have some objective, and we propose a solution to achieve that objective. And then we take it to trial. Like I said, we don't take a debate approach where we argue the pros and cons of whatever proposed solution it is, because we found that that's too easy to simply for one side to poke holes in the other side, or to, you know, focus on technicalities instead of the issue. So instead, what happens at the trial is that there's a pro team, part of the legal team. The pro team argues for the proposed solution, but provides a comprehensive plan, not just words, but really describes how they would do it, which might mean tempering the solution somewhat. And then the con side, they argue another solution. they're against the pro solution, but they're not just simply against something. They also have to suggest something positive. They have to say, how would they address the objective in a different way than the proposed solution? And typically they take a more conservative approach, something closer to the status quo than the proposed solution. So in 2021, we considered 3 cases initially. One was about working from home, the idea that to promote a better life-work balance, Americans should have the right to work from home. The second one was to ensure sustainable food supply, that regenerative agriculture should be prioritized by the government. And then the third one is whether it is, in order to fight polarization, a mandatory national service should be adopted in the country. And so at the beginning of the semester, the students divided into groups into each of these, to study each of these cases. They spent about 2 weeks trying to look deeply into them as far as they could in 2 weeks, and to decide which of those would be the best one for us to do. And we have a variety of, a bunch of criteria that help us make that decision. Those results were presented on a webinar about 9 days ago. And if you're interested, you can see the recording here. I'll put that in the chat afterwards so you can find it if you want. Anyway, they presented, the 3 groups presented, and then we voted. We being the students, the instructors, and also all the attendees that looked at the recording, which was almost 100 people. So we were quite pleased with that. And what we found was that the winner over all categories, the students, the instructors, and the attendees all voted for the Fight Polarization case. And so that is the case that we're doing this semester. So now how do we do that, right? So now we're in a difficult situation because we have to take this case, which I said is to fight polarization. We propose mandatory service. And now we have to really investigate that, look at what does the science tell us, how are we going to argue pro and con, what are good strategies, and so on. And so we have a process to do that, which starting from this year, we've taken what we've done before and we've sort of restructured it based on a systems engineering type of an approach. This is sort of a standard approach that's used in engineering to address complicated issues. And I have a picture of the International Space Station because many of the components of that space station were designed using a systems engineering type approach. The recent trend is to apply these to problems in societal problems rather than engineering problems. And the person that we've been talking to about that is Jim Hartung, who actually worked on the International Space Station and is now interested, he's retired now and he's interested in applying these to social science type problems. And so the idea is there's a flow chart that we follow. We first identify the stakeholders, in this case, the stakeholders that are affected by polarization, and what are their needs and requirements. We then define sort of top level objectives that any solution that we come up with should satisfy. We then go and research the facts, and these divide into scientific domains or academic domains more accurately, and then sort of questions under those domains. And that's what our science team is researching. And as they do so, they may come up with additional stakeholders that need to be added to the list or additional objectives. That leads us to beginning to put together pro-con strategies. As I said, arguing, how to solve polarization. The pro is mandatory service and the con has to be something else. And then again, that can feed back into the process to look at more questions, identify more domains, and so on. And then finally, at the end of the process, we come up with our pro-con cases that are going to be presented at the trial. So this is the process that we follow. So today's event is to basically show you where we are today in that process. Technically, we manage this using software called Trello, which is a software management or a project management software. Basically has a board like the one you're seeing here, where every column is one aspect of our case. And underneath that are questions and issues that we're discussing. This is where we collect our information. The students communicate through this board and so on. So that's like our command center for the project. And so our plan here is kind of tenuous. The students will sort of walk through this board describing what we're looking at and Kerri can take it any direction she wants as she's listening to this. I just want to point out to everybody to, not to have to kind of put the expectations, make the expectations reasonable. We're just starting this process. We're only 3 weeks or 4 weeks into it. The students are just learning this. And so for us, this is really about what are the questions we should be asking, not so much what is the answer to this question or that, because we may not know the answer to that yet, or the students may not know it. And so for people, the attendees from outside, we're really bringing you into our process here. It's like you're sitting in our classroom as we're trying to figure this out. And so keep that in mind. It's very much preliminary. Audience members can ask questions. There's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We can't promise to get to all of them live, but we'll introduce some of them. And we can also answer them. Some of them that we can't, we'll try and answer in text. So that is what I had to say. And with that, I will return control back to the group. And maybe, so we now have sort of that board is divided into categories, and we'll start with the first group that's just going to give the overview of the whole thing.
Alrighty, are you guys able to see my screen?
I can.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with the case statement. So as Professor Todmore explained, the purpose of the issue that we are attempting to solve is American polarization. And our goal is to create more unity or a common American identity. And so with that, the pro argument would be to institute mandatory service, which would involve military service, as well as volunteering with an NGO or with the American Red Cross, other groups like that. And then the con would be either political engagement through citizen assemblies, as well as potentially moving to a ranked choice voting system, or instituting civic education in our schools, such as like the program Legislative Semester.
Kerri, I just want to check. And we know you're on the phone. Can you actually read any of this on the Trello board?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just double checking. Okay, good.
Yeah. So Madeline, is that it, or did you want to say more?
I was going to say, I'm just covering the case statement. My other two group members will be covering the stakeholders and the top level objectives.
Okay, so they will join in here in a minute?
Yes.
Okay. This is all technology, right?
Yeah, I can hop in now on stakeholders if we're ready for that. Thanks for sharing your screen, Madeline. So for starters, we have taxpayers who are important because it's probably taxpayer dollars that would pay for these different, like the implementation costs of these different service opportunities and programs. Young adults, because that's the group we're targeting. There's some research to support that younger people generally like efforts to change their opinions or their minds. It's easier to do that with younger people versus older people, according to some research. And also just like in terms of structuring it into your life, like a period of mandatory service that works better generally if you have fewer responsibilities, which not for everyone, but typically tends to be true for younger people. We also have communities who would be receiving the volunteers and services. It's really important to consider not just the benefits and the impacts that these kinds of programs would have on the people doing the actual service, but also the communities where they're serving, considering things like how having potentially outsiders in your community might have some unintended consequences and that sort of thing. The government and politicians, because the government would be overseeing the implementation of these programs. And also the government would stand to benefit, we think, from having a less polarized society. So they're a stakeholder in that way too. The military, because for one, it's a potential opportunity for mandatory service. People could elect to serve in the military as their service, but also the military, so like you might have an influx of people essentially into the military who don't have any intention of staying beyond their period of mandatory service. So while there could be more people, it's possible that that wouldn't be entirely positive for the military. employers because young people might be bringing different and new skill sets that could benefit their future employers, educational institutions, because this might kind of disrupt the traditional education path from like high school to college. Maybe it's like high school to service to college, or high school to college to service, something like that. Parents, just because these are young adults, so it's possible their parents still have some say and influence over what they do with their lives. And that's kind of what we have as our overview for right now. I can answer questions, and we can move on to objectives.
I have some thoughts, but why don't we wait until we get on to the objectives?
Sounds good.
Sure. So just our top level objectives are just key characteristics that we're trying to accomplish with this pro argument. And that first one being is that we're hoping mandatory service can unify the American public, and by decreasing the polarization, which is our overarching goal in the end, is to decrease the polarization. And through that, we would possibly unify the American public. Our next objective would be for our mandatory service to provide skills to its members. So they're not just going to be in the military, but also like serving the Red Cross or through NGOs. So those useful life skills should help these people. And the mandatory service should help improve outside perceptions of the U.S. For other countries as they have relations with the U.S. And with that, we could improve those relations in the near future. And also the service should benefit every citizen, so allowing them to feel more comfortable in the US, and with less polarization, it'll be a more unified community. And then the last one, this service should be economically beneficial for companies and citizens themselves, and we'll get more into that with the science side of the economics with the research. And that's what we got for objectives.
So who's up next here? Economics domain, maybe?
Yeah, I can go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one comment regarding the case statement. One of the things that we were debating was whether we should be talking about a common American identity. If you read our statement, it says, what does it say to, I don't see the board anymore, but it says something like.
Here, I can throw the board back up real quick.
Thanks. So to reduce polarization and recreate a common American identity, and then we propose mandatory service. And then there was some debate in the group whether, recreating a common American identity is a valid goal. Has there ever been a common American identity?
Exactly.
Should we be striving for that, and so on? So that's part of the discussion that we're having right now in terms of what exactly we want the objective to be. So I just want to put that on our radar.
Okay, yeah, so I can go ahead and jump into economics. Our group tackled economics and sociology, and in these topics, there's a lot of questions that we still have that we don't quite have answers for. But just when it comes to economics, first obvious question, how much would this cost? And just like, would it be financially and economically beneficial? And tagging down a number for exactly how much it cost was difficult, but for how financially whether or not it could be financially beneficial, we did some research on it and we found out that we believe that it would, just because when you're investing, it would take a lot of upfront financial investment, but we found that we would get that investment back through fiscal returns, such as the actual output of the service itself, perhaps tax on that output, or oh, do I need to zoom in? Sorry. Is that better?
I still can't see it very.
Sorry, I'm on a big monitor.
Yeah, I'm seeing all the columns at the moment.
Okay.
But I'm following your presentation, so I don't know how
Mhm.
important it is that I,
Okay.
you know,
And so we found that we would get back some fiscal returns in that way, but then also a lot of social benefits, especially in the long term, such as increased community engagement, increased service in the future, the kind of human capital that we would be building through the skills training that we would be giving the participants in the program. And so that's a big question we had. One quote that let me pull up the one quote that I liked that I found from a report from the Columbia University Center for Cost Benefit Analysis. Typically, economic evaluations of service programs have found that their benefits exceed their cost, even when they're only considering the terms of services provided rather than the overall long-term effects, which there are many, and many of them are more intangible. And another question we had was like, there are benefits to this, but what is the cost of just doing nothing? What is the economic cost of polarization? And we found that some reports have said that partisanship can influence consumer expectations, possibly in negative ways. Like after a new election, people will have doubts, and that can affect consumer purchases, consumer decisions, which can have negative effects. And we also found that it can create antagonism between like different people interacting, which obviously is not good. And that kind of discourages reaching out to different people, taking more risks, and it just kind of closes off. And we found like these economists found that the economy does better when more people are just overall engagement and interaction is higher. So I can turn it over to Minerva to start on some sociology, because we just had some questions about like what programs we could implement that would be both economically beneficial but also engage the people to want to serve.
Yeah, so moving on to the top of the sociology column here, we'll notice the question that asks, does mandatory national service increase national unity and or does it decrease national polarization? And when we examine this question, I think one of the things that should also be looked at is possibly, does the effectiveness of increasing like national unity change with what type of mandatory service we use? So would it differ if we use something more of like a conscription-based mandatory service versus something more like the Peace Corps or a Climate Corps perhaps? And we did already mention what do we define necessarily as common American identity. So I'm going to breeze over that for a bit. And also, does interacting with a diverse group reduce bias, prejudice, and discrimination? Now, if we click on that, I don't believe we have actually found much sources on it yet, but I do think that is one of the things we should be looking at. So in addition to that, we also have, does a country's or a culture's level of individualism influence opposition to compulsory policies, which is also similar to the other question, which we haven't quite found necessarily research on yet, but I do think it's worth looking into. So in addition to that, I'm going to turn this over to David here. What effects would mandatory service have on minority populations? And I think it's also important to examine, well, like who's being affected.
Right, precisely said. So when we're considering how mandatory service might affect minority populations, it might be worth, in some cases, to consider, or how previous examples of service is being expanded, it affected the minorities. For example, I believe it was Simon Lovrich's study from Social Science Quarterly, he drew reference to the desegregation order by President Truman at the end of World War II, which didn't really help the political status, but it did show that there was social and career advancement, given that there were more African American officers after time. and this also applies to Hispanic populations as well. And so, at that point, we need to perhaps look at mandatory service, and we need to consider what effects it might actually have on minority populations, especially with their political perceptions. Also, we need to consider things such as how different groups of people will respond to mandatory service. For example, like as mentioned before, there's different types of mandatory service from conscription to Peace Corps, and so what we need to consider is how people will react to these two different groups. So it's difficult. It might be difficult to properly understand the direct effects on some minority populations, and it's a good amount of these voluntary programs do have education requirements. For example, Teach for America requires a college degree, and the problem as well is that at our the selection of people who do engage in voluntary service is always going to be biased, since people with smaller incomes in general are going to have less leisure time, which means that they are underrepresented in voluntary service programs. However, if we can change gears and perhaps answer this using the Belfield study, the one from the Aspen Institute that was mentioned earlier, by considering the ratios of social benefits to cost. I'll just go over this briefly. National Service by Youth has like a 3.95 ratio of social benefit to cost, or over 2.1 ratio of fiscal benefit to cost. And so in aggregate, it's like a 3.9 social benefit cost ratio and a 2.2 social fiscal benefit cost ratio. The report also mentions that a lot of this is scalable, so it would be interesting to see how this expands as well. All right. Remember, I think you had a couple of things to say about the types of mandatory service as well.
I just wanted to also mention that one of the things we're also looking is how we're effectively going to engage those who are going to be essentially service members. So in this case, we have been examining what topics have been particular concerning among young people. And in I believe, a survey done by Stanford, the topics that constantly came up were like environment, education costs, and also I believe housing and immigration. So one of the things this comes into is, what should the incentives be if there is an incentive? So this could be being interested in the topic of the issues themselves. This could be like a loan forgiveness program. This could be like paying for college, and it could also be something like giving work experience. And I believe this also ties in a little bit to economics in that sense. So.
Yeah, definitely a lot of crossover and a lot of questions that we were able to come up with without a ton of time for research. I just wanted to touch on this one question right here. Does interacting with a diverse group reduce bias, prejudice, and discrimination? Didn't get a chance to mark that down on the Trello board, but we did find some data, and some data, the little data we have is promising. I particularly remember some data from people who were involved in Teach for America, who then responded more positively to questions around racial, class equity, and things like that. But we can hand it on to the next team.
All right, to start off our preliminary psychology research, we wanted to know what approaches to breaking down barriers between groups are effective, and we found that discussion in heterogeneous groups and learning about other cultures are effective ways of reducing of breaking down barriers between people. And this would inform our decisions on how to implement a mandatory service program or civic assembly. So one of our goals for mandatory service would be to draw from all over the country and bring people together who normally wouldn't interact. Another question is, does engaging in mandatory service change people's perceptions of the country? From some experiments done in a smaller setting, for example, in a school, they found that the feeling of the pressure of external control had a negative effect on the students who were participating in the program. So we were wondering if there would be backlash on a larger scale. Would mandating service improve tolerance and cross-group understanding in the same way that volunteerism does? So we found evidence that these concepts of tolerance and cross-group understanding improve when people volunteer in underserved communities. So we were wondering if making the service mandatory would take away those positive outcomes. What is the best age or life stage for a person to engage in mandatory service? So the immediate obvious answer that we were initially thinking of would be right after high school, but there is evidence that shows that outcomes of service are improved with a more highly educated service population. So maybe after higher education would be a better option for that. Does participation in mandatory service improve self-efficacy? So we also want to know if, so one of our objectives for mandatory service is improving work skills. And that would include hard skills that you could gain from working in a certain field, but then it would also include soft skills like self-efficacy. What factors lead a person to become ideologically inflexible, or which leads to polarization? And openness, which is one of the big 5 personality traits, is key in this, but then I'd also be interested to find out what leads to development of different levels of openness. How do people react to carrot and stick approaches? So this relates to both punishment and incentive, and which is more effective, or is a combination of the two more effective? Do mandatory service members believe they are benefiting their community in the same way volunteers do? This relates to whether mandating the service takes away from the positive outcomes of volunteerism. And then our final question in this domain is, how can mandatory service be marketed to people so that it's accepted? And it's important that the populace accepts this as a positive thing. I'll turn it over to Philip.
Yeah, so I was mostly working on the health, and it's obviously not like a specific focus of the case statement in itself, but there will also be likely some pretty major effects on health in like basically 3 major potential ways. So first, like, we're looking at how specifically service would affect people's health, both physically and mentally. And obviously this would vary between service, but like potentially military service could make people more physically fit, but also more likely to have injuries, possible mental health issues later. We'll have to look into how that is working, and especially broken down by types of service. Secondly, how people's health affects their eligibility / ability for service. What kind of like services can potentially like disabled people be a part of? What will be health requirements to be in various different services, stuff like that. And then lastly, how the reduced polarization would affect people's health, both mentally and physically. And I did, like on the last, haven't found good empirical research on it yet, but it does seem like political polarization is negatively affecting mental health. So then like reducing that would be a positive effect. And for people's physical health, reducing polarization, I also haven't found good empirical research for this yet, but one would think that it would likely reduce like violent protests, riots, and or hate crimes. So those are the main things that you want to be looking into as for health in relating to this case statement.
So as for education, the main questions that we had were like regarding what kind of education people can get from mandatory service, like the kind of knowledge or skills they might receive, or like maybe how the prior level of education can affect what mandatory service they can go into, as well as how mandatory service will affect kind of the education system, like universities and things. So for kind of like the skills that individuals might gain, like there are already countries that do mandatory service, like France, and France is looking through mandatory service. They are learning more skills such as like first aid, rescue skills, or conservation, and learning practical skills that they might not learn otherwise. And other countries that are also doing this is like Ghana, who they have to do a year after college in agriculture, health, education, local government, or in rural development. And along with education, you have questions such as like, how do you like kind of measure the educational benefit people might get from serving, or how will it affect university enrollment? Because if people do decide to go to mandatory service before college, that could affect how many people are going into universities and how effective these mandatory services can be in providing an education. And just like general questions based on how the education received from mandatory service can affect people's futures. And even if like, because there's different fields of mandatory service, could one resulting education be more valuable than another? So that's for education, so I can turn it over to the next group.
Hi, so I'll be talking about the legal team pro and con. Just to preface what we'll be talking about today, we appreciate everything that the science team has done, but like what we were focusing on over the last 2 days was really how do we best tackle the problem that the case statement is asking us to solve, which is political polarization. And so for the pro team, we tended to look for what could be possible causes and solutions to political polarization, some of which have been mentioned by the science team. So one of it found by a study was that people tend to associate their policy beliefs with partisan cues. So even if polls can show that most Americans, let's say, would agree with stricter gun laws, but if a person of a different political identification is offering that solution, they'll be less inclined in order to accept it. So what we were trying to hope to look at this angle was that how could like things like mandatory service or other solutions that could solve this particular problem. Another possible cause for political polarization is a mixing of moral beliefs with political beliefs. The same study found that people tend to excuse moral violations if it was done by somebody they can politically identify with as opposed to somebody who's not. So some of the solutions that could be come up with to counter these causes are intergroup contact. And that's something national service would definitely offer: intergroup contact racially, across political beliefs, ideologies, and everything. Second possible solution is perspective switching, where you imagine yourself in the experience of another person who's unlike of yours, and imagine how they would have to navigate their lives within the context of the political problem you aim to solve. These obviously would come with increased intergroup contact, A third interesting solution, actually, for the pro side especially, is creating a superordinate identity, or creating a global human identity, or American in this case, in the sense that if, like, this was controversial in our case statement because somebody, a few individuals are like arguing if, like, is there really such a thing as an American identity? Has it existed before, or should it even exist? What the study, what this paper found was that regardless of whether it has existed or should exist, we found that if you do focus on like a broad goal on what you as a group want to achieve, that isn't tied to any particular facets of your own personal identities or your group identity, people tend to be more effective in coming up with solutions to this. And this can be found in the military, where regardless of what the individual's backgrounds are entering the military, they form their own militaristic identity when being part of that, and that tends to stay with them. I didn't manage to link the study here, but it did find that that identity stays with them, and people tend to be more cognizant of it and making decisions regarding that problem. Another possible solution, which my colleague Hannah will be talking about, is proportional voting systems. And a fifth one could be specific policy referendums. Now, referendums were controversial, I think, because of Brexit. But this paper found that specific policy referendums, where you specify changes to laws, let's say if people want to legalize certain drugs or things like that, or they want to decriminalize certain things, suggesting specific changes could result in less political polarization, as opposed towards electing political parties to do this for you.
Okay.
Now I'd like to pass it on to Nishant to talk about national service.
Hey, Lad, can I break in here for just a second?
Absolutely.
Okay. I feel like I have a pretty good sense of how you're pulling this all together, and that, you know, as you've noted, there's some overlap in this. And I feel like maybe because we're getting a little short of time, and maybe I could share some initial questions that come to mind. Unless you guys think I'm missing something really essential to the way this is proceeding.
Maybe we can just say like another minute or so just to describe the Khan approach, because that hasn't been mentioned yet.
Okay.
And
In the
we'll switch
legal
over to-
side of this? Okay,
Yeah, the legal
got
side
it.
of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
I'll pass it to Hannah. I can still share the screen.
Yeah, I'll go to the Khan approach. So basically, it's civic education. And with this approach, I was really looking at questions about curriculum, because curriculum has not been decided on. It's always being debated. So that can never be figured out. And then if the process itself have implemented something with civic education, whether it's like civic assemblies, like they did in the Irish Citizens Court, where they basically brought 100 Irish citizens together and they put them into different groups, some based on political parties. So some were left wing, some were right wing, and then others were mixed. And they found that more mixed groups were more likely to shift their opinions. And then another idea is with civic education, will this help to combat political polarizations, given what subjects we have like students look at? So that was a big part. And then I looked at ranked choice voting, and some questions that came from there were, how effective is ranked choice voting for fighting polarization? And do states have the capabilities to do that? Because that's often actually been debated. And then the last point is ranked choice voting constitutional depending on the state? What Maine found was it's not constitutional for general elections of state representatives, state senators, or governors. So that can be debatable. But I feel like those are the main points for our Khan areas.
Okay.
All right, so we can turn it over to you now, Kerri.
Okay. Just a couple things come to mind, and I sense that this is kind of at the heart of some of the questions that you're wrestling with, which is American cohesion kind of a nostalgic idea? Are we can we ever return, and would we ever want to return to a time when there was a lot more homogeneity among racial groups and income groups The divisions were much starker. You know, do we have to redefine what a more cohesive society looks like, given the demographic changes that are happening in America? I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the falseness of Make America Great Again. Nobody really, except, you know, people that liked it in the 1950s, believe we can go back to what we looked like and who we were in the 1950s. So when I think about what you're asking about political partisanship, by the way, polarization, I think, how do we define a depolarized community that's realistic for where we are today? And then that led me to some questions about polarization, which is something I think about often for my discussions on the radio, which is, are we talking about political polarization? That's usually what people think you mean, but there's a lot of other dimensions of polarization that are affecting the way we are getting along and not getting along, which is cultural polarization, geographical polarization. I can't tell you how people respond when we do conversations that take into the rural urban divisions that have developed. And Minnesota is a great state as an example for this. The response is really instantaneous. People feel this in a visceral way. There's a perception that if you live beyond our metro areas in Minnesota, Arizona, name the place, you just don't have a commonality with the people that are in the cities, whether that is true or not. So I would ask you, when you think about, and I have a note here about racial polarization, of course, but I would think, when you're thinking about polarization, what do we actually mean? And how do we, does mandatory service really solve geographical polarization? Well, maybe some of the mandatory service, but maybe some of it doesn't. So I would lay that over some of these questions that you're asking. I mean, the other thing that came up for me was what our team member who was talking about the Irish example, which was really interesting. How do we get our elected representatives who might be persuaded to pass some kind of legislation requiring mandatory service, but how do we get our elected representatives to buy into the idea that they will, I mean, I guess here's where I'm coming at. Our elected members of Congress, many of them, benefit from the dissension, the polarization that exists. And why is that? Because the true activists of the party are the ones who turn out for the county convention, turn out for the state convention, turn out in the primaries, and they send the people that are representing those views. And the commonality in the middle usually doesn't prevail. I mean, that's why there's such a dwindling number of moderates in Congress. So from their perspective, some of this polarization is beneficial. It drives donations. It drives votes. Look at the turnout from 2020, highest presidential turnout ever. Because why? We are super polarized. So that's one of the things that comes to my mind is our elected class, our political class may say all the right things, but they're very aware that they benefit from the dissension of polarization. So I think we have to really think about how to get beyond the rhetoric. Everybody wants a more depolarized community, society, and really think about how that political class would buy into this. One of you guys mentioned the incentives beyond more of just a cohesive union. And I can hear you wrestling with this, is like, if you poll people, they will say, yes, I'd like a less polarized society. but a lot of us do things that contribute to the polarized society. Look at where we buy our homes. Look at where we worship on Sunday mornings. Look at how we spend our discretionary income. So I would suggest get beyond just the granted, everybody, look at where we send our kids to school. Get beyond the, sure, everybody wants a less polarized society. Now, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to change in your own life? You know, some of this is easy. Let's just take everybody from high school and tell them that they have to have, you know, mandatory service. But what my mind goes to is how do I have some skin in the game of that? And how is it hard for me? Because I think without, if somebody else is doing all the sacrifice, I don't know that I'm all that committed. Sure, I like it in the abstract, but what's my contribution? What's my sacrifice to this? Does anybody, I mean, some of these things that I've raised, maybe answers are coming to mind. Does anybody want to jump in and give me some thoughts on that?
I guess I could try and jump
Okay.
in. When you were talking about like how we could attempt to combat different forms of polarization, and I was thinking in terms of like racial and geographical polarization, that's one of the main aims of the program is just to help reduce them just through exposure, just through travel, interaction with other people. And with political polarization, one thing that I think really contributes to that, especially with young people, is just how engaged we are in the internet, and how that kind of can create echo chambers, and you're seeing modern trends have been showing less engagement in community and more engagement like just with like people who believe the same thing as you on the internet. And studies have shown more community, like participating and volunteering in the community makes young people more engaged and interested in what's going on in their community. So I was thinking that that would be one possible way that mandatory service could help.
You know, you raise a note something that I made a note of here, and I don't know how this fits in, but you know, the role of the news media, I mean, what you're saying about social channels is super important. I'm sure you know this better than I do about how influential it is for people your age. But I also know that the reinforcement of the news media and how we divide off to, as you're saying, the echo chamber. What role does the media, right now, again, I kind of come back to where I was with the political class. The news media benefits from this polarization. I mean, you know, there's a reason that Fox News had big numbers and MSNBC had their highest numbers after Joe Biden's inauguration. The easy thing is to stand at 30,000 feet and say, we all want to be more of a cohesive society. The hard thing is to look at the players who benefit from this and say, what do we do with them? You know, with the self-interest that's pushing back on this idea of a more cohesive society. Does that make sense? I mean, social media companies, look at how long it took Facebook and Twitter to get on the stick with, you know, banning hateful speech. Why? It's not that they don't really have the resources to do it. They benefit from this kind of polarization because, you know, it drives clicks. So anybody else have a thought on some of these other questions?
Yeah. So you're mentioning, you know, the political class, which I think is a really interesting point to bring up, especially since for most of our solutions, we do in fact need them to pass things and if they
Right.
have no interest. I'm wondering what you think. I'm wondering what you think about ranked choice voting, which, you know, the idea of it is to allow for
Yeah.
there to be more parties, as you know.
I don't think it's a panacea. And I think people that support it think this is going to solve everything. The way that people who support a third party, and now, you know, I'm sure you're hearing all the discussion now about that what we really need is a third party. I just don't think it solves, because so much of this polarization is, as you've noted, as you've all noted, it's at the identity level. And ranked choice strikes me as a tool. Yes, maybe more people get their second choice. They don't feel like it's such a binary choice. But what does it really do to solve this identity thing that says, my life isn't like yours because I live in Minneapolis and you live in Bemidji? I guess I think it solves things on the fringes. And the part of the reason I think that is, you know, I've seen this, done a number of shows, read a lot about the places that have initiated it. And I don't think there are any less polarized communities in those. And that might be something to look up. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, my mind also goes to one of the other tools that I think has been interesting on gerrymandering. And this is kind of like, here's an interesting, I know we'll solve some of the polarization by not drawing these districts that are so ridiculously, you know, drawn to benefit one party or the other. And what they find in the states like Arizona and others that went to independent commissions, it mattered, it didn't solve it. You still had districts that are the consequence of polarization. So I guess I'd say beware of tools that you think that's the solution. More skepticism, I guess. And I would ask you to dig into some of these other tools that look like they're the great answer to all this. Does that make sense? Madeline?
Yes,
Sorry, I
sorry.
didn't hear you there. I think you were muted.
I
Okay.
was sorry. I didn't want to speak up, but then I
Okay.
guess I guess it's like, it's not necessarily like a question necessarily, or I'm not really sure what it is,
Yeah.
but are we right now trying to change culture?
Yeah.
Because it seems really, you know, that is kind of, from what I'm understanding of what you're saying, is that we're fighting the fight of changing culture, which is kind of like a perceivably endless battle. So then is it that we have to use a conjunction of tools then?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're identifying that I'm saying, and I don't want to be overwhelmingly pessimistic here, but, and I don't think I am, and it's great that, you know, your teams come to this with some fresh thinking. That's really what's needed. This is what I love about Science Court. But I guess I would, as you're pursuing this, really test assumptions about, as I was kind of saying, well, if we just had independent commissions, gerrymandering would be solved. If we just had ranked choice voting, people wouldn't feel like they had their binary choices. There's been a lot of this kind of problem. If we just had third parties, you know, I guess I'm saying bring more skepticism, because there's a lot of experiment and example out there. And here we are, ever more polarized. There's some good pilot programs and some states experimenting with this that I think you could look into. Does that make sense? Here's a question I had for, and maybe this is the economic team. I wondered if the vision of mandatory service could be more imaginative. Like, could an apprenticeship at a company be considered mandatory service? Yes, you're in the capitalistic, it almost sounds like kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do, this altruism. But I also, then I listened to you all talk about the skill set and the maturing and all of that. And I thought, would there be a way to factor that in to an idea of mandatory service? Does anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I'm not one of the students, but there's kind of a model for this happening right now in our industry, Kerri, which is in media. There's a program called Report for America that is kind of built on this idea. I believe it's nonprofit funded, but it's a similar sort of thing to Teach for America, but you're placed in a newsroom, and it is meant to be sort of be like an internship.
I
Is
love
that what you're getting at?
Example. Yeah, that's a perfect example. I was just thinking there are organizations and even companies that are working for the greater good, right? And are there ways to count that kind of, it's not an internship, but are there ways to count that kind of apprenticeship where you are really there to learn the craft? Or is that really something that is completely separate from what everybody's talking about here? I had another question about this recreating a common American identity. Alad, you said earlier that this is, you're still tinkering with this. Is that right?
That's right.
What kinds of questions are you raising about that? That sounds really interesting.
Well, I think first of all, Jess is the one who first brought it up as in our discussions about this. So I think it's related to what you were saying before. You were talking about the fact, is this all nostalgia, and are we going back to some vision of America that maybe only existed on TV, or you didn't say that, but I'm adding that. And
yeah.
And then you asked, which I found interesting, was what is sort of a realistic depolarized society that we might imagine? And so I don't really know, but I think that if we want to tackle polarization, our first step is, as you say, to understand what that means and what are the different facets of it. And then if we want to tackle it, does that require a common identity? Or doesn't it? Can we live in a society that's not polarized, where people can function together and make decisions and not have this sort of overarching common identity? Or is it necessary to have a common identity? And I don't know what the research will show on that. That Arun mentioned before, the idea of creating a common identity that people can rally around, right? Like people who join the Navy SEALs or the Marines, and that gives them a code of conduct and so on. So you can invent an identity, or you can find a problem that we all face and can connect with, say climate change, and create a climate corps, and just like Kennedy's Peace Corps, and basically drive large numbers of people into this task, which is a unifying identity, which is not cultural or anything, but it's a common problem that we face. So those could be methods to creating a common identity, but maybe we don't need that. Maybe you can.
No, I think that's really super interesting, because it's I'm a something, but I'm an American first, and however you think of that, and it does feel like that has slipped away, doesn't it? Okay.
Well, it used to be that America stood for democracy and opportunity, right? People came to this country for freedom and because of the opportunity to make something of themselves. And both of those have eroded over the years, right? And so do we try and recreate that? Do we try to find something else that we can lead and identify around? So that's how I'm thinking about it anyway.
I had through your whole presentations, I had the pandemic foremost in my mind, because in a time of a crisis like this, it really tests the bonds, right, of a country. And we saw what happened with that. And so when your economics team was talking about the cost of polarization, the first example I thought of was exactly how we're seeing that unfold in this pandemic. Higher mortality rate, higher costs economically, higher social costs, isolation. I mean, you can go down the list of different cost metrics, and every one of them, I would argue, and I think this is backed up by a lot of the reporting out there, is heightened by the fact that we came into a pandemic highly polarized, and we had to some degree, political class that contributed to that polarization. And now we see what happens. I can't think of a better test of a real life test of what polarization means. Alad, what do you think of that?
I think that's very insightful. I think if I was on the legal team, that might be a very good way to phrase it, right?
Yes.
And try to show people what the cost was of this. So that's, yeah, I didn't make that connection until you just said that. So
should we ask what the legal team thinks about that?
I haven't personally found thought about looking at the cost of the pandemic, but I definitely found research. I think Andrew touched upon it briefly, that in a polarized country, people, especially during the economy, also tends to affect how people believe and think. And you can see with the rise of QAnon and conspiracy groups left and right, people tend to, and research has showed that people tend to take risk-averse strategies when it comes to politics during economic decline,
Right.
or income inequality. So probably that aspect of the mandatory service would be useful, or for the con team to argue something entirely different that can help tackle that. But I think I agree with you, Kerri, just in general, when you said that this would probably require, and Madeline too, a conjunction of tools. But that's probably going to be hard for the pro team to argue, given this case statement.
Right. Right. Are there other questions that come to mind about anything I asked, or the last time, Elad, that I was there, as you've noted, you guys were further along in the process. It's almost kind of as interesting to hear it at this point than it was to hear it as further along. But we also talked about kind of effectively making the case. I think you're going to get to that later in the class, right? Later in the arc of the class.
right.
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to synthesize all this information and figure out how to argue it.
Okay.
That's really
Got
what
it.
the legal team is going to be doing. And the media team will be reporting on what we're finding. That's how the class progresses. So, but yeah, this is the really early stages where we're trying to get as many things out there that we should be thinking about. And then we'll begin to kind of decide what's important, what's less important. Your points about politicians, I think, are important. So that's the stakeholders, basically.
Right.
And maybe those, politicians need to be at the top of our stakeholder, chain, because they're the ones that can basically, prevent any of this from happening. So figuring out how we can put together a solution for polarization that has positive effects for them.
Right.
So,
I mean,
go ahead.
I realize I sound cynical about this, but when you see the way even the response to the election, again, as noted, everybody knows this, highest turnout in a presidential race in history. And then you look around at some of the state legislatures and how they are responding to that. There are state legislatures that are right now debating legislation to make it harder to vote. I mean, this is where my cynicism comes from, is most Americans, if you just polled them on access to the ballot, they're going to say something I think, pretty optimistic and, pretty contributory to the idea of our democracy, which is, yes, we shouldn't make it hard for people to vote. But then you look around at the actions of the politicians. This is something that's really been on my mind. We're going to do a series of shows on this again. I just, the self-interest is so undeniable. And I feel like it gets in the way of what most of American people, I think, want. So in any big change, you have to kind of ask yourself, what's the political class going to do about this? How are they going to try to stop it or slow it down or twist it for their right?
Well, just not to be, the positive spin on this is that I think it's extremely unpleasant to be a politician these days.
Yes.
You have to deal with all these people that are,
Yes.
at your throat. And so their work environment is horrible. So if there
Good
was a
point.
way to fix the system that wouldn't affect their chances of being elected, but created a nicer environment for them, then, that's a benefit. Now, the thing is, maybe other people would be elected. So that's, it wouldn't be the same people.
Right.
So it's not quite so simple, but that's the way I would try and approach it,
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to change if we still want to sit on this. We've got a couple of student questions.
Okay.
Madeline and then Hannah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so sorry, I've been thinking about your comment. You said something kind of in passing about how it used to be you were an American first and kind of everything else second or farther down the list. And I guess I'm wondering, because I have been lucky enough to have the experience to study abroad. And kind of when you're interacting with people not from the United States, they don't really care what state you're from, just kind of
Yeah.
whether like what country you're from. Do you think that potentially having people do things abroad where you leave the country and interact with people who don't really care about the party politics about the United States or like what state you're from or where in that you're from, do you think that could potentially help the American identity in becoming American first? And
I think that is so huge. I mean, I had the same experience that you did. I went abroad and studied in college, and I've traveled a lot since then. And it changed everything for me. What I can remember realizing my second week in Europe or something, that America was not the friggin' center of the universe, like you grow up thinking it is. And it meant everything to me. It gives you such perspective and I think maturity, and it gives you a view on American exceptionalism that is more skeptical. Doesn't mean there aren't exceptional things, but it's a super valuable view. So yeah, if mandatory service involves some level of sending people overseas to do that service, other than only the military, yeah, I think that would be super valuable. It's just astonishing how quickly you meld into you observe another culture and realize that the things you just took as doctrine, absolute truths, other people question. And that is really kind of earth-shaking, and super valuable. I'm glad you brought that up.
Hannah.
Well, first off, I'm a big fan, by the way.
Thank you.
But what do you think about civic education? Because a lot of the things you brought up were, these are just tools we use to fix, problems in the current, and long-term effects, it just doesn't work. So what do you think about civic education?
Yeah, Hannah, I was really glad that you were focused on that, because I have to say, to a person, almost every guest that I have on the show, where we're wrestling with these questions, right? The polarization, they will talk about the lack of civic education. The big argument is, well, what is that?
Yep.
Right? I mean, God, where was I just heard some story. I think it was Arkansas is trying to eliminate, some history of the 1619 project that the Times did, or slavery. I mean,
Yes.
so these idiotic battles about what civic education should look like, that's my concern. That we all decide, yeah, we need better civic education, and then we all go into our corners and argue stupidly about what that should be.
There would be polarization even within that argument, right?
Right.
Yes, exactly. I mean, look at the way Texas argued for years over textbooks. But and that's another one where, you know, I will have a conversation about this, and people will, with good faith, call in and say, this is what's missing. We don't know the tenets of our democracy. And you know what I feel like the best civic education has been in the last year is watching what happened on January 6th. Could you ask for a better civic education? That's what happens when the foundation of a democracy trembles a little bit and somebody tries to undermine it. I hope students saw that for what it was. Not that we were on the verge of coming apart. We weren't. But that's what that looks like. That's super valuable. But, you know, that's kind of a high level, and then we get down into the arguments about what kids are going to learn. But yeah, I think it's really important.
Follow up to that. Do you think then it's the media's job to really hit on teaching policy and stuff? Because that's where I always go back to. I'm like, I'm watching the news. Don't get me wrong. I love journalism. I mean, I'm in it. That's my major. I love it. But we just get to talking about, oh, these people look like this. It just becomes about polarization, not about policy.
For
So
sure.
like, if we talk more about policy, would that fight polarization?
Yeah. I mean, you've really nailed a lot of the superficial analysis that goes on polarization. But you know that you can find the good stuff if you're looking, but you have to be motivated to look.
Yeah.
I mean, you obviously listen to public radio. I'm sure you know the other sources to go to. The dilemma is that, you know, kind of as I was suggesting, for much of the media, it's in their interest to create kind of these channels that fit the echo chamber. Okay, policy. I love policy. I don't even know how many of my colleagues love policy. I mean, to be honest, I don't know, CJ might have a thought on this too. You know, I don't know if that's the way to bring more people, you know, into this idea of, I mean, this is kind of what I meant about one of your team members was talking about gun control. I think it was the legal team. Maybe Arun was talking about that. And I was thinking, you know, 70+% of Americans believe we should have more restrictive, not totally restrictive, common sense gun control, as the proponents would say. Yet it doesn't happen on Capitol Hill. So I don't know if policy, yes, we should all become policy nerds, is really the answer. It's really how to get to de-incentivize the people, all of us, political class, us, citizens, voters, from going towards the loudest, the sharpest, the most ferocious rhetoric. And that is such a challenge. The echo chamber. Yeah, that's what you guys are really tackling here, kind of beneath the question, I think.
Got another student, Nishant.
Hi, so my question is how do you think international students and immigrants can factor into this? Because although this is more centered around Americans trying to combat polarization and bringing about that equality, as an international student myself, I have grown up my 20 years sort of worshiping America and putting it on the pedestal that it's the superpower culturally, economically, in whatever ways. And that's what brought me to the United States as an international student. So, and a lot of people come here to find their future and because you have the opportunity to continue your education, work here, and become a citizen and become an American. So, how do you think as international students, because the polarization does affect us in
Right. Oh my gosh, absolutely.
so how do you think we can help in this?
You know, I want to say, I listen to you say that, and I feel pride that you grew up where you grew up and looked to America as you said, put it up on a pedestal. And that makes me feel proud. And that you thought, with all of the dissension and the rhetoric about immigration and everything else, you thought there's still a place for me there. So that's terrific. I also would say, listening more to the people that come from the outside in to say, this is what I see is super valuable. We're not good listeners as Americans. I mean, think about the way we try to solve healthcare and we don't look to outside of the American border. We feel like we've got the best ideas. But I think a true receptive kind of listening is important. Do you intend to stay, or do you think with your degree, or do you intend to return to where you grew up?
Well, I'm planning on pursuing my master's and PhD here. So in a way, like we get, sometimes you get afraid of what happens because you hear cases of hate crimes against.
Yes.
So you get scared, but that's as I said, like you look at the education, you look at the 200-year plus history of this university and so many universities in the United States, and you're like, you know what, it will get better, and because that's what America stands for. So that's why we say, okay, we're going to do masters here, even though everything looks like it's falling apart.
Okay, good. You've made me feel hopeful. I'm glad to hear you're not saying I'm going to get my degree and get the heck out of here, because it's not what I thought it was. So that's good. It's good to hear.
What do you think, to follow up on Nishant, what do you think demographics is going to do to all of this? So, I mean, part of the reason this is all happening now is because we're on a tipping point, right?
Right, right. Hey, you know who I'll point you to somebody that I read all the time and have gotten so much insight from, and it's Ron Brownstein. He writes for The Atlantic, and he talks about that a lot, about why the reality of the demographics. It's really nuanced analysis. Let me say that, because, we hear people say, well, I saw some headline, I think in the Times today, that said something like, the people that rushed the Capitol, many were financially insecure or something. And I thought, that really is too simple.
Mm-hmm.
I'll answer that by saying, I look for a lot of nuance in the reporting, and Brownstein and others give that to me. And it gives me hope that the way out is time passing and demography changing. It's going to be hard in the interim. And I think that kind of high level, what I think of as gold standard analysis, is really valuable to that. Maybe it would be valuable for me to hear whether there's anybody on the teams that, like, where you're going to get your smartest analysis of what's been happening.
Well, just one more comment on demographics. That the Stacey Abrams said that demographics is not destiny; it's opportunity.
Right.
I thought that was an insightful comment, right? And so I think demographics provides us with an opportunity, but it could also easily backfire.
Right.
And so, but there's something to consider as we're considering this now.
I mean, what I've tried to do is not boil it down to, these are white people, many of them white men, who are afraid of losing their power, because I know it is more nuanced than that. But when I see the faces of the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, the naked entitlement is really hard to ignore. So I fight back against my own. I can sum this up and, that's what this is. And I really look for nuance in the demography because it is so complicated.
Mhm. We should look into that. I think that should be a domain in one of the domains under sociology to look into demographic effects.
Good. Yeah.
I think
One
it's
thing-
interesting.
Sorry.
I
No,
have
go
one
ahead.
thing to add on demographics, because I think what you and Alad are mostly getting at is the racial demographics. But the other big demographic change that's happening is a general aging. And I think that is an interesting facet to that conversation.
God, for sure.
Especially if you're talking about some kind of mandatory service or some other kind of program that primarily targets a younger generation.
Right.
What kind of imbalance does that theoretically set up in society?
Interesting.
No, those are really good questions. I mean, that's why I was kind of saying, what's my contribution to this? I like the idea of mandatory service, but I feel like I need to make a sacrifice too in bringing something to a depolarized society. I think somebody in the sociology team also asked how individualism influences a sense of cohesiveness, which is a really good question because, our creed in this country seems to be really built on this, what I think is an outdated idea of rugged individualism. But that is how we see ourselves. And I wonder how that pushes back. Am I right that the sociology team was asking about that?
Andrew's nodding.
Okay, Andrew. Yeah. So I think that's a good question. Like, how do we balance the two ideals of that?
Arun, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. I guess time is almost up. Kerri, I was wondering, we're talking about democracies and countries. What country would you consider right now to have like the most functional, or at least the most functional that a democracy can be, that has a healthy discourse and things like that? Do you have any in mind that maybe you could
Yes,
look
I have
into?
an easy answer to that. And unfortunately, it's not as diverse of a country as I would hope, but Canada. I mean, doesn't it seem to work? You know where else? New Zealand. I was in New Zealand last year, just before the pandemic hit. And so I was able to see firsthand that they haven't got all the questions and differences about their Maori population solved.
Mhm.
But man, they are on the right track. And, if you look into their history, you can see the way they have tackled kind of country changing moments. And I'm thinking of more recent history, like when they had a mass shooting and what they did about it. Yeah. They don't want more. They don't, unless you've got millions of dollars or you marry some Kiwi, they don't want us,
Right.
unfortunately. And I don't
I
blame them.
learned that firsthand because I lived there for a hot second. I did not want to come
You
home and I
did?
could not figure out how to stay. I did. Really
You
didn't
lived
want to
there
come
for
home.
how long?
I lived there for almost a year right after college. Didn't want to come back. It was delightful.
You should have, I don't know, hooked up with some.
Kerri, I tried.
You tried.
Kerri,
We're going to have to hear that story, CJ.
I know. We didn't know this was. So I don't know. I mean, what do you guys think of? I look at Canada and I just think differences, problems, big problems that they have to solve, but they haven't descended into this conspiracy-driven insanity. How did they avoid it? I think about that all the time. So
You have, I know you have a family engagement.
I do. Yeah.
Um,
What time is it? Okay.
Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah,
Mannix
I do.
One, and then I
Sure.
have one. Okay, Mannix, go ahead.
Okay. I was thinking that one way to bring the older generations into this would be what we were discussing earlier with outsourcing the service positions to enterprise, so then you can bring young people from all over the country to work for people who are older generally. And then
Yeah.
also with civic assembly, that would include people of all age ranges.
So you're thinking, if I own a company, I'd be willing to take on somebody in mandatory service.
Sure,
I mean,
and
that's
maybe there
my
would be,
contribution.
and maybe there would
Aren't I-
be an incentive for that, whether through taxes or something else.
Aren't I kind of getting free labor and somebody else is paying for it though? What's my sacrifice on that end of things? Training somebody.
Training.
Yeah.
You're mentoring somebody.
Yeah.
Mentoring. Yeah. I mean, isn't this what the German society does? They set up these apprenticeships and the state basically pays for it
Mm.
with some combination of the company.
We should look into that.
Yeah.
And then my last question is trying to bookend, one of your very first comments about how do we define the scope of our enterprise here as Science Court,
Yeah.
different facets of polarization. So Kerri, if you could pick from the long list of potential polarization facets, political, cultural, geographical, racial, or demographic, economic, what, let's say 2 or 3 would you pick for us to focus on?
Yeah, I think I'd have to come down to the demography because it's such a catalyzing reality. There's no getting around it. And I couldn't ignore the racial polarization. We see that on display all the time. And then maybe I would tackle, I look at between political and geographical. Don't underestimate, what I can't remember, Bill, I can't think of his last name, called the big sort. The way we are sorting ourselves is powerful. And people don't think they're making those choices. Oh, I moved into this neighborhood because I love the people next door. Oh yeah, there's a school there that's mostly white, that kind of stuff. So I think that might be how I distill it. And that is no small job. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys wrestle with this.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted.
Okay. Elad, I actually think this is more interesting to come in at this level than, towards the end. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's.
Do you? Okay, good.
I think it's extremely helpful to us early on in the process to get this feedback. I've scribbled down 2 pages of notes. So
me too. I've scribbled down a bunch of notes from, that I will work into conversations that I've got coming up on this stuff. So this has been very valuable to me too.
Fantastic. Well, I
really
hope it
appreciate
becomes
that.
a tradition.
I do too. Is this, you always do this in your, winter semester?
No, we used to do it in the fall and we switched to the spring because we found that our trial was just on top of Thanksgiving and Christmas and it didn't
Got
work
it.
well.
That's right. Okay.
We're going to do it in spring from now on.
Okay, good. Good to know. Okay, I wish you very well. Thank you. You guys are really great listeners, and I love it that you're bringing your imaginations to this. This is hard. It's good.
Thank you. Well, maybe everybody can unmute and we can just give Kerri a round of applause and thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Applause back. Thank you. All right. Thank you. See ya.
Take it easy. Bye.
Bye.
Well, thumbs up, thumbs down. How you guys feeling? Yeah, me too. It's very good.
All right. Okay, so with that, we'll end our formal meeting. Let me just tell you on what's coming up next. Tuesday, we have, I think, CJ, right? You're giving a skills training. So she'll give a lecture about presentation of scientific or scientific data, or how to present that to a lay public, basically, and which is what she does. So it'd be great to hear that input. And then we'll go back to our case review and start the process of distilling, processing this information. Also, if you have thoughts or comments, you should feel free to add to the Trello board, add new questions, add comments, whatever, based on the notes, any notes that you took from Kerri. We all had thumbs up, but I really thought it was fantastic. I think there were so many good comments you made that made me think in so many different directions. I think that's exactly why we wanted her to come. So, all right. So with that, we'll say good night and see you in next week. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.